Well, good evening, everyone. I hope you have been able to keep cool during the horrid heat wave last week, well, at least in the East Coast or part of the US. Today is the last day of the heat wave, and the rain came, thunderstorm came, and everything, so it's cooling down. Okay, so I hope everyone's doing well. Now, I've been exploring how the spiritual path needs to evolve to meet the demands of the 21st century life and also the 21st century people, right? And I was always a great lover of the wisdom of the world, right? Of the great religious and spiritual traditions of the East and the West. Not only that, it's also I really have deep respect and love for the indigenous wisdom around the world. But I always had the sense that so many of us in the West, in the contemporary world, were trying to apply ancient spiritual technologies to modern problems, right? And it seems like there just had to be a spirituality that is more in step with our times and maybe with our lives. So I kept asking this question about how the spiritual path, right, needs to evolve to meet the demands of modern life and also the poly crisis that we're encountering right now. So I, of course, not only studied and practiced Master Shen Yan's teachings, I've also studied works from Ken Wilber, Craig Hamilton, maybe John Perkins, Otto Schwammer, Deepak Chopra, and so on and so forth, all these um, leading spiritual teachers. So, in this talk, I will introduce you to the concept of evolution.
Sorry
Okay,
about
so
that.
I'll introduce you to the concept of evolution. So, namely, the evolutionary impulse within the context of spiritual practice. And I will also talk about ego, since you see the topic is ego, our enemy on the path. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. I'd like to begin today, as I do with all my talks and all my sessions and my teachings, with a brief meditation. Okay. Now, life is a very brief journey. It's very, very brief. We can either be intimidated by that truth that it's very brief, or we can be inspired to live life to the fullest, right? So, a jewel of truth is actually hidden in every moment in life. We can pause and ask, what's really going on here? Or maybe we could ask the question, what is the deeper reason why I'm responding as I am? So there's no end to the quest for truth in our lives, or, as the Buddha would say, the breakdown of our illusions. It is a long road to becoming an empty vessel. So, in the clarity of that empty space holds all the phenomena of the universe. So I rest in the grace of the universe and I'm free. And this journey requires endless endurance where there's nothing simple about encounters with truth. And I'm pretty sure uh, US practitioners would know that too. So, right now, I would like to do just a very brief heart centered meditation on that moment. Okay, let me say it again. In that empty space, which holds all phenomena of the universe, I rest in the grace of the universe and I'm free. So please sit comfortably, relax, and close your eyes. So let us focus our attention on our hearts, that great center of our being, and imagine your breath coming in, right, through your heart and then leaving through your heart. Kind of like 5-second breathe in and a 5-second breathe out. Breathing in on that 5 seconds, the grace of the universe. And then that feeling of freedom as the breath goes out. Breathing in the inclusivity of everything. And then as the breath goes out, that feeling of freedom. Phenomena are just a river flow of causes and conditions, coming and going. When it comes, let it come. When it stays, let it stay. When it goes, let it go. In a moment, you're going to hear the sound of a bell. So when you hear that bell, just breathe in slowly. And then you'll hear another bell. And just breathe out slowly. So we're all going to take 10 breaths together to bring ourselves in unity and solidarity with each other, generating this kind of coherence. Okay, so we're going to start. Okay, so now you can open your eyes. I'm going to pose a question to all of you. There's a reason you're on a spiritual path. And if you could actually just share why are you on a spiritual path, that'd be great. You could type that in the chat box or maybe raise your hand and share with us. I'm going to ask Warren to help facilitate this because, when I'm doing PowerPoint, I can't see faces or anything. So, and Warren, as you see, maybe the chat showing up in the chat box, you can just read it as it shows up. Or if you see people raising their hands, you can invite them to share. Okay, so why are you on? What's the reason that you chose to be on a spiritual path? And what's the reason that you chose to practice?
Yeah, sure thing.
Thanks, Warren.
So feel free to type into the chat or raise your hand with the reaction button in Zoom. For those of you on YouTube, feel free to type in chat too. I'm not sure if I set this up right, but it's pretty quiet so far, Venerable.
Okay, that's okay. You just give people a minute or two to kind of think about it.
Okay.
What is your, what is the reason that you chose to be on a spiritual path or a practice?
Well, feel free to unmute yourself if that's what you would like to do, if that's easier. I think everyone is shy.
Well, let me just share with you maybe to help start the conversation going. Right, the reason why I chose to be on a spiritual path is because I felt there's an emptiness inside my life and in my heart that I just can't fill being a consumer, just doing things what everyone expects. So I was seeking for the purpose in life and how to empower myself to be a better person, right? So that's the reason why I chose to be on a spiritual path. Maybe Warren, you could share too. What's the reason that you're on a spiritual path?
Yes, and let me share that right before you start,
Hmm.
giving your own examples. If you don't mind, since this is Zoom, Tony said that to embody the Buddha Dharma.
Mm, wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you, Tony. And for me, is that I think there is a innate desire, right? When we experiencing something that is beneficial to ourselves, we wanted to share with others. And so when I first started with Dharma Mountain many years ago, through meditation, that was my entry point. And benefit from it, began to volunteer since then. And I realized there are just so many folks out there that is in need of and could benefit from this. So the journey just continue and learning like what Tony was talking about, right? Buddha Dharma. It's just kind of like the law of gravity. It just makes sense. If we don't believe in law of gravity, we can just try it and jump off a cliff or somewhere. Um, that's Buddha Dharma.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you, Warren, for sharing. And thank you, Tony, for sharing. Um,
Tony. Yeah.
yeah, did I say wrong? Right.
No, that's
Never mind.
fine. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank
Yeah.
you, Warren and Tony, for sharing. That's wonderful. So, actually, in your heart, that a profoundly awakened life is actually possible, right? Because we're all looking for this awakening. Whether, you've read about it maybe in books, or maybe you have a taste of this enlightenment in your own direct experience, you have a knowing deep within that it's possible for human life, like your life, to express something truly extraordinary, right? Something that is more than just you, right? Just like what Warren was talking about, volunteering. But if you've been on the path for any length of time, you probably also know how challenging it is to truly live an enlightened life, right? Maybe this sounds familiar, okay? So you can touch into a deep source of stillness and this radiance when you take time to go within, right? But then you haven't yet found a way to bring that depth of and that radiance into every moment of your life. Raise your hand if you experience that, right? Don't be shy. You raise your hand if you experience that. Or I don't know, some of you didn't turn on the video, so Warren can't see, but just like click one of those, what do you call those? Response thing?
Reaction, what have you?
Reaction, yeah, the reaction thing, so that we know. Raise your hands if you've experienced that, right? You actually experience this deep source of stillness and radiance when you take time to go within, but then you just haven't found a way to bring that experience, right, into every moment of your life. Raise your hand if that is what you experienced. Just me?
And me.
Okay. All right. So maybe it's like, although you know that nothing is more important than your own spiritual practice, right? You know nothing is more important than that. But you often find yourself prioritizing other things, maybe to the detriment of your own growth and evolution. So if that's true, please raise your hand.
Tony raised his hand a while ago. Yeah.
Okay. Right. So we know the importance of our own spiritual cultivation, but then we often find ourselves prioritizing other things to the detriment of your own growth and evolution. Raise your hand if that's true.
Yep.
Yeah, great. Or maybe it's like, you aspire to express love, kindness, equanimity in all your relationships, but you still often find yourself reacting out of the unconscious emotional patterns of your past. So it undermining your own efforts towards this conscious relationship, right? You aspire that, but you just can't seem to do it. Or you can access a deep clarity and wisdom when you take the time to be still, right? Sitting on the cushion, right? But when faced with difficult decisions in your daily life, it's often hard to access that inner wisdom to know which road to take. Yeah, right? So the plain truth is that even those of us who have tasted this spiritual awakening, right, we still sometimes get caught up in unconscious patterns, right? We still often react emotionally in the face of life's challenges, right? We still struggle with worry and fear and doubt and insecurity. And as a result, our daily life rarely lives up to the potential that we have tasted in our most enlightened moments. But what if it didn't have to be this way? What if the depth and freedom that you've tasted in your most profound moments could become the living foundation for every moment in your life, even when the going gets tough? So this possibility is closer than you might think. So the reason most of us struggle to realize our full spiritual potential is that we're unwittingly attempting to live a spiritual life while still fundamentally centered in the separate sense of self or ego. So, as long as this is the case, it won't matter how hard we work at the path. We'll always end up short of the profound transformation we sense is possible. I first became aware of how challenging this issue of ego is for those of us on a spiritual path, right? So you see, um, living in a spiritual community afforded an opportunity to see some things about the human condition that are not normally apparent. Now, most of us spiritual folks, right, are convinced that we deeply want to change and evolve in all the right ways. We want to be a good person. We want to be enlightened. We want to transform. We want to evolve beyond the ego, right? And we therefore assume that most of the obstacles to our higher evolution are external obstacles, meaning we think that if only all of the circumstances, the inner and the outer, would line up just right, then we would leap into the outer edges of our highest potential in an instant or maybe pretty soon. So, in other words, we think if only we had enough time for our spiritual practice, or that we have enough support and surrounding us, and maybe the right guidance, maybe the right environment, then we would soar spiritually. We would just be enlightened if only all of these things are present. If only we have all of these things and everything else is out of the way, right? It's a very convenient theory because for most of you, this theory never gets tested by reality. Why? Because in this world of our busy modern lives, the circumstances really never line up just perfectly, right? There's never just enough time to do all the spiritual practice and the retreats and the workshops that you want. And there's never enough time there's never enough support around us because we have a lot of people who are less interested in this than we are. So we can carry on believing if only all of these things line up, all these external things line up, then I can soar spiritually. But the good news is that it is possible to make a fundamental shift in our orientation and begin engaging our spiritual life from a completely different part of the self. The change that changes everything lies in the discovery and activation of a usually dormant part of the psyche that we tap into when we're evolving, when we're changing. Now, this part is not the timeless, changeless self nature that we say in Buddhism. And it's not the conventional ego self, the DIY, how do I improve, that most of us live in every day, right? What this is actually, this part of the psyche is actually the creative force of the universe that is alive within us, right? The grace of the universe, the human face of the impulse of evolution itself. If you think about the universe, the creation of planets and all of these things, it's just very natural, right? So there's an evolution in that process. Let me ask another question, okay? So I know some of you may not be comfortable sharing, but I kind of like my talks to be a little bit more interactive, but just do what you feel comfortable. Again, the question now is, what is ego? What do you understand of ego? What is ego? So you could type it in the chat box if you don't like to, you know, be seen in the video or talk like that, but just type in the chat box. And Warren, can you please help facilitate this? What is ego?
Yep, absolutely. If you want to be anonymous, then you can just type directly to me if you like. Okay, self-centered.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just reading the chat. Thank you.
Yep.
What else? So while everyone was just thinking, in one of the my meditation workshop, I usually give a chart, and the statistic has shown from the research is that we learn 5 to 10% between hearing and seeing, but when we start sharing with each other, it's a whopping 70%, I think, 75%. So um the beneficial is for ourselves. Okay, so another one. Dominated by a self, and there isn't one.
Mm,
Thank
yeah.
you. Oh, self-esteem or self-importance. Yeah, I skip one.
Mhm, mhm.
Thank you.
Warren, what is ego? What do you think is ego?
It's basically the actually, I don't know what ego is, but it appears every single time.
Mm,
When we
good.
become realize it, it just disappears in the thin air, like a thief. What is that? Who could that be? I have no idea. Thirst to practice. Sorry, that was a foolproof answer, I know. Okay.
That's fine.
Um, continue on. Self-identity affirmation, self-importance. Thank
Mhm.
you.
Okay. So I'm just going to continue. All right.
Okay.
So the
Thanks, folks.
question becomes, does the ego ever come into alignment with this evolutionary impulse that I was talking about, race of the universe? And if so, what happens to it? Right? Does this ego go away? Maybe dissolve? So what is ego then? It really, this question here is it depends on which ego you're talking about, right? Ego is a term that is used in different ways by different people to mean different things. So when you hear the word ego, you might have a certain set of reference points, right? But they may not reflect the definition of ego that I'm going to be using, right? So there are many different ways that people talk about ego, right? But for the purposes of this conversation that we're having, there are two main definitions that I'm going to be using. All right. So the psychological and the spiritual. So the psychological definition, which originated with Freud, right? It talks about ego as the functional center of the psyche, right? It's the organizing principle of the self that allows us to engage with the world, right? It's where our values and commitments live. It's our psychological center, which allows us to make good, healthy, mature choices and not be ruled by our primitive impulses or by the influence of others, right? So this kind of ego is something that never goes away. So that's the psychological definition, right? But the definition of ego commonly used by spiritual teachers is something altogether different from the psychological definition. So ego in this context is your self-image. It's your story about yourself, but it's even more than that. Ego in the context of spiritual practice is the emotional investment you have in your self-image. It's not even self-image alone. It's the emotional investment you have in your self-image. It's your attachment to the story you tell about yourself that causes you to defend it no matter what. And you defended it, with a lot of uh, uh, zest, right? You really defend it and you perpetuate it, right? So if you're invested in this narrow and limited view of yourself, the story of who you think you are is actually very narrow and it's very limited. it will be extremely difficult to discover the limitless consciousness that is your true nature beyond the ego. Right? It's for this reason that in spiritual circles, ego is often described as the primary obstacle to awakening. Someone said, our self-centeredness. Understand that now? So going back to the question that I have posed on top, right? I think what it really is asking is, can my own sense of self become fully aligned with the evolutionary impulse that is very open, the grace of the universe, natural evolution? Can this impulse become my core orientation for how I relate to the world? If you look at that this way, the answer is yes, yes, yes. This kind of reorientation of your own psyche is definitely possible. Does the ego ever disappear? So some people like to say the ego can disappear altogether. Okay, so who would agree that this is theoretically possible? But I don't think that's a safe assumption for any human being to make. We're still too early in our evolution. We still have too much primitive hardware and software at play in our psyches, right? Regardless of how aware you are of the ego's tendencies, or maybe how much freedom you've cultivated in relation to it, the ego tends to persist. The ego keeps going, even when you've seen that its stories are not worth listening to. Maybe its impulses are not even worth following, but the ego keeps going. It has a kind of momentum from the past that causes it to continue to derail the evolutionary process. So even when it might seem as if the ego has disappeared, since we sit in meditation, in our cultivation, in our practice, it would seem like, ooh, the ego has disappeared. It's more often the case that it's gone dark, it's gone dormant, and will eventually reform and find its way back into your life. So it is dangerous to ever assume that the ego has gone away. You need to always be on the lookout. So never think that the ego disappears. Now, the concept that I was talking about right now that is new that I'm introducing to you is, what is this evolutionary impulse? What is this evolution thing that I'm talking about? Right? So the definition of evolution in science is, it says evolution reflects the adaptations of organisms to their changing environments. So still talking about change. How do we adapt to the changing environments? So it's talking about impermanence. All right, so there's three reactions to evolution. The first one is resist and die. The second one is run away. You could just try to run away from that, but you can only run away to the point where there's nowhere else to run. You're cornered, and you still have to decide if you want to change or you're going to resist change. And the third one is evolve, and you thrive. Very interesting, right? So watch this. This ego, this is what it's doing. It's resisting it, or it's running away, or that, you choose to embrace it and change and thrive. Now, in the spiritual practice, this is what is evolutionary impulse. So it is an agenda. It's an agenda towards positive change. It's an agenda towards the manifestation of the good, the true, and the beautiful, and maybe even more elevated ways, even more complex ways of manifesting this. So that's the evolutionary impulse. So how do we transcend this kind of pathological ego, right? The next question is, what do we do then to deal with this pathological ego, right? The emotional investment you have in your self-image. How do we get out of the way so that we can become a fuller expression of the evolutionary impulse? Openness instead of being very closed, right? So the first process, or the first step to the process is learn how the ego operates. You want to observe its patterns and tendencies so that you can get to know it very well. You want to know how the ego operates in general and how it operates very specifically in you. So by beginning to understand the ego in this way, you give yourself the freedom to choose whether or not you will allow its impulses to guide your actions. So learn about it. Observe its patterns. See how it's manifesting within you. So then you know what to do. So over time, as you're doing this, you can get to a place where you consistently see the ego for what it is, and then choose not to respond to it or choose not to follow its unwholesome impulses. You want to get to the point where the ego is no longer getting you to do the kind of things that are not in your higher evolutionary interest. This is an important juncture in your own evolution, right? It's the point where you can attain freedom from the ego through your own awareness of it and the cultivation of a deeper motivation to no longer be driven by it. So you gotta learn what it is. You have to understand what this, how pathological it is, and how it unfolds in your life. Now, when it comes to our higher spiritual development, right, our higher self-evolution, now most of us don't want to change all that much. Not really, right? So we know that we want to evolve, so our higher self-evolution. But the funny thing is, most of us don't want to change all that much. Not really. So let me clarify. Okay, most of us wants things to change, yeah. Meaning we want to feel better, we want to feel, maybe we want to be happier, we want our lives to go smoothly, we want our relationships to be good, but we don't want to have to change our deeply ingrained habits of being, right? Our habits of relating to other people, our habits of identifying with and reacting unconsciously to the thoughts and the feelings that runs through us. We don't want to change those. Interesting, right? And the reality is that there's a big part of us that does not want to let go of the familiar ways of being and behaving that we're actually accustomed to. Why? Because we don't want to get outside of our comfort zone. Okay? What's the third one? There's a primitive and deeply ingrained impulse towards the preservation of the way things are, right? So over and over again in this kind of context, we essentially saw the same pattern. We would wake up into an expanded level. What's this pattern though? So we would wake up to an expanded level of consciousness in our practice, and then we would fall back asleep, contracting back into the narrow egoic self, right? We'd actually step out of the ego into a completely different, or maybe more enlightened part of the self. And maybe sometimes for extended periods of time, it could be days or maybe weeks, maybe even months, but only to find ourselves retreating back into our egos again. Now, I can speak from my own experience that in the midst of the spiritual community, I had many powerful experiences and insights and openings, deepening things, and some of them lasting for days, some for weeks, and some for months. But no matter how far out there, I would seem to go, in the end, I'd always find that I somehow ended more or less back in the same place, right? So what does that mean? Things about me would change, right? But then I wouldn't really change. I was still the same person. I would still react out of old patterns. But still at times maybe be insecure and fearful, socially self-conscious, and sometimes falling into self-doubt on the one hand, or, flipping into overconfidence or arrogance on the other hand. And maybe you can recognize some version of this pattern in your own experience if you've been doing spiritual work for a while. Although I'm sure the details would be quite different. So why is it this way? Why do we do it this way? So meaning, once you get all those external obstacles taken care of, and it's smooth sailing theoretically, right? So if what we really want is to awaken and to become more conscious and to realize our potential, why won't we just jump at the opportunity when it presents itself? Why wouldn't we let go of everything when the higher potential revealed itself? We still go back to the same stuff. We still go back to our old stories. See, what we had to confront is that most of us, the self-proclaimed spiritual practitioners, okay, are people with evolutionary aspirations. We want to change, we want to improve. But deep down inside of us, we're still largely being run by some very ancient, not very evolutionary software. So you see, the reason, even the perfect circumstances, even with the most elevated spiritual experiences, they don't have the power to lift us into this higher level of being, is that because we're still operating within ancient habits of consciousness, right? So remember, for the vast tracts of our human and animal evolution, we've existed within what you would call survival consciousness, in which the name of the game was always just surviving. Right? And all of this is still very deeply wired into us. So trying to change this is actually a big deal, very difficult. It's a very big deal. It's challenging. So here we are until now. The organizing principle of human life has been basically survival. And now, here we are, a generation that has the opportunity to live in a completely different way, where our survival needs are basically met. I'm sure for everyone on this call, on the Zoom talk, right? Everyone's basic survival needs are actually met. And we now can focus on the flourishing of our higher human potential, right? And the creativity of our emergent spiritual potential. But we're still all patterned inside ways of being that are the opposite to that higher flourishing. So what are these ways of being that come so natural to us, right? We have a habit of wanting to feel safe and secure rather than recognizing that the unknown, that insecurity is really the source of vitality, change, and vibrance, right? The grace of nature, of the universe. It is vitality, it's change, it's vibrance. Let me give you an example. How many of us know that we feel most alive when we're taking what you might call healthy creative risks, right? So meaning when we're stepping forward and we're trying new things and we're exploring, or maybe we're saying things that we're not sure how they're going to land, or when we're really out there on our own edge and trying something new that you don't know, and you stretch and you really, really stretch and discover that, hey, you could, kind of peak experience, right? That kind of like excitement, that kind of feeling very alive, right? So most of us probably know that's where the juice of life is, right? That's where a human being comes fully alive. Not just going through, like the hamster in their, what do you call that? The running wheel in the cage, right? You just keep running, you just keep doing the same thing again and again, the old patterns, you just keep doing it. That's not alive, right? That's when you go out, right? Try something new, stretch, experiment. The unknown, that when you come fully alive. Yet, in spite of that, how often do we hesitate? We take the easier and maybe the less risky path. We hold back. We're tentative. We're not sure because we don't know what's going to happen. So part and parcel of this clinging to safety and security is the desire to force certainty, Okay, let me say this again. The desire to force certainty rather than being open to what we don't know. Right? Let me repeat this again. Now, all of why this is happening is because the clinging that we have to safety and security is because we have this desire to force certainty. Okay, so it's the key. Notice the verb force. Okay, certainty rather than being open to what we don't know, which again probably makes sense because at a certain point in our evolution, right, sticking with the sure thing was the surest way to stay alive, survival consciousness. But that's not our situation right now anymore. Life that we have in the modern society is different. Okay, so now, similar to that, there's also this habit of wanting to keep everything the same, right? Not wanting things to change, which, as you can see, in a context where we're trying to evolve, trying to keep not wanting to things to change, right? When you're trying to evolve can be a real problem, right? Trying to maintain the status quo. Fear of change, for example, have any of you actually, let me just raise an example, let me think, for like the fear of change, okay? Now, how many of you actually have ever stayed in an unhealthy relationship that you knew was no longer serving the higher flourishing of the two individuals? Hmm? Or maybe stayed in a job that you had outgrown and you knew you needed to move on, right? And maybe if you haven't seen that in yourself, you surely, you would know other people who've done probably both of those, right? Excuse me. And why? Because we don't know what was around the corner. So the unhealthy familiar, right? It's more attractive than the uncertainties of an unknown future. So even if we know that what we're currently doing isn't good for us or it isn't good for anyone, but we'd rather stay with this unhealthy familiar because we are fearful of the uncertainty. So another one is we also have the habit of when we confront changes and problems. So instead of being open to new possibilities and learning into the future, and also in our own creative response, we tend to look into the past. And then we basically repeat the patterns of the past in response to difficulties. Hamster on a wheel, running in circles. You're still repeating the patterns instead of saying that being open to what can I learn from this? What can I learn from the challenges and the problems? Remember, a failure is a failure if you don't learn from it. But a failure is a lesson when you can learn from it. But we have this habit of being in the hamster wheel. We look into the past and we repeat the patterns of the past in response to this. We also have the habit of blaming external circumstances or maybe other people for our difficulties and challenges, rather than taking as much responsibility as we can and being generative of the kind of future that we're committed to, change, evolution. So when you do it this way, right, blaming external circumstances, blaming other people, we're relishing our victimhood, villainizing other people. This victimhood is ways in which we're impacted by others. Now, it's not to say that, these external circumstances or people don't create difficulties. I'm not saying that, but we choose to blame external circumstances for it. But what's the most generative and empowered response to any situation? It's to take responsibility for your part. See what you could have done differently, and see that you could be doing, and see what you could be doing differently to shift it, right? So that's the evolutionary stance, right? So it's take responsibility for your part. I'm not saying take responsibility for everyone, but take responsibility for your part in the problem or the situation, and see what you could have done differently, and also how you could be doing differently to shift it. So this is evolutionary. But how many of us actually live in that stance? Not most of us. And even if we do, it's like once in a while. And it's not most of the time, right? Okay, now the next one is we also have a habit of avoiding difficult truths about ourselves, about others, about our circumstances, rather than just always facing the truth directly. So the brain scientists call this cognitive biases, right? The psychodynamic theorists
Hmm.
refer to them as ego defense mechanisms. So there's a whole bunch of ways in which we're constantly deceiving ourselves because we can't bear the truth. This is a big problem if you want to evolve, if you want to live in reality. This is a big problem because it will prevent it from moving forward. And we also have, oops, let me just I haven't quite finished on this slide here. Okay, so we also have the habit of thinking small, thinking short term, rather than in a larger long term context of what's for the greatest good. So we avoid difficult truths, and this is some of the consequences. Now, I've just been speaking about all these habits, right, that we were talking about. So as though, they're distinct habits, right? So internal resistance, our comfort zone, our primitive impulse, the organizing principle of human life is just surviving, right? And maintain status quo, avoid difficult truths. Now, it sounds like, they are distinct habits. Now, in some sense, it can be helpful to look at them that way and address them as separate issues or habits. But from another perspective, it's really valuable to recognize, okay, it is very valuable to actually recognize them as um, expressions. So they're expressions of one thing. So everything I just described makes up what you could call the character of what's traditionally in a spiritual context has been known as the character of ego. So Warren, do you know what ego is now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. And I hope you can see that the ego that I just described is a huge problem if we want to live an awakened, liberated, evolutionary, and creative life. Because as you can see from everything I just mentioned, the ego's agenda is the very opposite of what we might call the agenda of the evolutionary impulse, right? Which we can see if we look at its larger trajectory. And it's an agenda toward positive change. Looking at the long term, it's an agenda towards positive change. It's an agenda towards the manifestation of the good, the true, the beautiful, in ever more elevated ways and more complex ways, right? So that's what we discover when we discover what that evolutionary impulse in ourselves. And it's what we see happening in the world where it's playing out. So you see, the ego just wants to keep things the same, even if they're not very good. It wants to keep things safe, small, secure, known, familiar. Which means that this greater impulse of evolution has no ability to flow through us. We can't access it when the ego just wants to keep everything the same. Oops. Okay, so now, when confronted with this part of us that just does not want to evolve, it often begins to feel like a kind of like intractable force. Like no matter how far we go, no matter how inspired we get, it seems like this small cell can reassemble itself again and again and again and again. And it's not that we don't make progress. Now, I'm sure we all make progress, right? In our understanding, in our direct experience, in our spiritual path. But it feels like no matter how much progress we made, right? The possibility of a radical leap out of ego continuously eludes us. It always is kind of like out of reach. And I have to say, seeing how, tenacious this pattern is part of what helped me to begin to understand why some of the great traditions saw the path to enlightenment as something that can take many lifetimes. So this thing seems so unmovable, right? It's in my very, very, very deep well. And it's going to have to take many lifetimes. And I'm not teasing the traditions here, because in today's progressive spiritual subculture, I guess you could maybe call it modern spirituality. There's also a lot that we read that tells us that, it's unrealistic to imagine that we could evolve beyond ego at all. We're told that maybe we should lower our expectations because we're only human, right? Which means we're limited and we're inadequate. So, but for me, I'd rather actually use this word human to refer to our higher potential, right? Not human as in like, the survival, but human as in the higher potential, the growth space in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Our self-actualization, right? So we can say that we're becoming human. Okay, but anyway, the mantra that we hear very often is, hey, we're only human, relax. Take the pressure off yourself to change, right? You can't really go that far. So there's a kind of modern spiritual consensus that says that the spiritual path at best is just sort of a gradual, gentle process of self-improvement. And that we should basically accept ourselves and accept everything else as kind of as we are and all of our limitations. So this is what we are, and this is my limitation. Just accept it, right? And at face value, I mean, this sounds reasonable. Yeah, it sounds very humane, and it sounds very gentle, and it sounds like psychologically enlightened. But I have to also admit that, after confronting the ego and myself for years, I almost came to that same conclusion myself. And indeed, I probably would have come to that same conclusion if it hadn't been for this, collective support and commitment of my community of friends and fellow practitioners. Because it was through that field of support and spiritual friendship, right? And this mutual commitment that the perseverance of this community around me that surrounds me, right? That enables me to push through this. So as I was pushing through this, right, a doorway eventually did open, right? A way through this puzzle actually revealed itself. Now, as I shared earlier, no matter how long any of us stayed there, right, we always come crashing back into the limited and narrow confines of the ego self. But then at a certain point, something unexpected began to happen. We started to notice, right? I started to notice that occasionally a very different part of the self would become activated. And that wasn't the small contracted ego self, right? But that also wasn't the absolute self, the self nature, the unmanifested self, which is beyond time and change that was discovered in traditional enlightenment. It wasn't that too, okay? But this new part of the self was alive and it's engaged and it's animated with spiritual presence and vitality. It was excited by change and it didn't resist feedback or opportunities for growth. It actually thrived on them. So this was like an utterly kind of life positive, non-resistant spirituality, which is robust, let me see now. So this is the utterly life positive, non-resistant, spiritually robust part of the self that was fully engaged with this world. But it was not transcendent, right? So it's not like the self nature or anything like that. But it seemed to be saying an unconditional yes. It says yes to change. And it says yes to evolution. And it says yes to challenge. Now, it's the part of the self that was no longer resistant to the challenge of self evolution. It was willing to face whatever it had to face, to struggle with whatever it had to struggle with in order to evolve, in order to awaken. Right? This is a very interesting part of the psyche. So, in our ego identification, of course, with the ego, we had a certain amount of life traumas and pains and difficulties and wounds that we're carrying, and we're struggling to try to overcome and get past. To a person, when they would awaken to this evolutionary part of the self, that history of trauma that needs to be healed, and all of these limitations and the identifications with limitations, they don't exist. Or maybe, let me just put it in a different way, okay? It's not that these, difficulties and traumas and pains and wounds doesn't exist, right? But it didn't have control over the person anymore. This part wasn't in the driver's seat. It was still there. Yes, it was. You could see it. You could, but it had no power. And it sort of started to pale to insignificance. And if you've been on the path for any length in time, you can probably sense the significance of that, of being beyond the resistance to change, of being 100% yes to whatever life is going to throw at me. So as we begin to let in the implications of what we're discovering, what happens was that our entire orientation, right, begins to shift. Shift to what? It begins to kind of to doing what we need to do to awaken, right, and to activate this part of the self. So this is kind of like, what Dharma Mountain's motto is, lifting the character of humankind, right? So now the reason this became, the primary focus was that, we begin to discover that as long as we could keep this part of the self, an evolutionary impulse, right? This part of the self in the driver's seat of our life, everything else would work almost miraculous. It's very interesting if you try it. Now, I don't mean we become like, miracle workers, that we're going to create miracles, right? But I mean, everything would flow. Everything would happen that needed to happen. Because instead of struggling endlessly against, our ego resistances, people would change immediately in response to feedback. They're willing to change because they only wanted to grow and awaken. And they weren't identified with, who they had been, or maybe, what their stories was. So instead of feeling like spiritual practice was some kind of a burden, I gotta go sit in meditation. Oh, I gotta do morning and evening service. Oh, I gotta go for a number of retreats, so on and so forth. We feel that it's a chore that, we have to do. It became this inspired engagement with the divine, really. And instead of falling back into old habit patterns again and again, people would find themselves relating to life from a place where these old patterns just don't hold any power. They're there. They're still there, but they don't hold any pattern. Right? They haven't disappeared. They just weren't compelling anymore. They don't have any more juice. And in addition, this deeper part of the self, it seemed to have a sort of like built in, what you would call spiritual, moral, evolutionary compass, meaning that it had this ability, almost uncannily, to respond to any situation in a way that was helpful, evolutionary, and sort of on target, hitting the bullseye, being open. Being open, and if there's any feedback or any lessons to learn, you make adjustments, you adapt to your changing environment. So that is very amazing. So you come alive, right? Instead of keep running on the same treadmill. So, but while the momentum of the ego may persist, like I said, I can assure you that it does get quieter, right? As we awaken to who we are beyond the ego. The truth is that the ego gets its power from our continued response to it, that we pay attention to it, and that we have obedience to it. So if you're not feeding it, and you're not paying attention to it, and you're not following it, it actually loses momentum, right? It loses power. So when you're no longer listening to it or obeying it, then it starts to fade over time. And then gradually, naturally, it will disconstruct. So simply put, when you take a consistent stand to no longer align with it, right, the ego stops bugging you as much. Right? It's there. It's still there. But it doesn't have as much influence as it used to. It goes from like the ego is like a Roth, what do you call this big dog, the Rottweiler, that that got you pinned on the ground, to being like it goes from that huge dog that pins you to the ground, to being more like maybe the ego becomes like a little chihuahua, right? Who's like a few feet behind you and it's yipping at your feet as you walk down the road. Still annoying, yeah, the ego is like yip, 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 right? But it doesn't really affect your walk. Even though you're aware of a noise behind you, but your eyes are facing forward. So thank you very much.